Welcome and thank you for joining us today for the Converge Virtual Looking Forward program. My name is Jonathan Toulon, aka JT. I'm the president of CONVERGED User Group. And by day, I am the Senior Director of Infrastructure and Cybersecurity for Mohawk Industries. Today, we're bringing you two thought leadership experts. These speakers are here today to share some innovative insights, and they're going to be here to also help answer any of the additional questions you may have. So please submit your questions through the Q&A and also share your thoughts in the chat. Now I'd like to introduce Jimmy Pike, SVP and Senior Fellow at Dell ISG. Jimmy, I'm going to pass it to you so you can share more about your background as well as kick things off for us.
Oh, thank you, JT. It's a pleasure to be here. So I am Jimmy Pike. I am a Senior Vice President and Senior Fellow at Dell, and I'm part of the Office of the CTO in the Infrastructure Systems Group. What I do is I focus on emerging technologies and how it will begin to impact our portfolio of products and services that we provide. My background is I'm a large systems guy. I was part of a startup inside Dell, which basically we were a hyperscaler company as far as putting together the infrastructure that was the pioneer part for what hyperscalers do today. And I also have a background in high performance computing, large machines. I'll put a plug in for the Texas Advanced Computer Center. There's a 40 petaflop machine that we put together. 40 petaflops is interesting because it basically says that you give all 8 billion people in the world a calculator, and you let them to do about 500,000 calculations a second, and that would be 40 petaflops. So anyway, glad to talk to you.
Yeah, Jimmy. So obviously you're a veteran in the compute game. So my question is what is the one thing that has impressed you the most about the evolution of systems from what it was from when you first started to where we are today? Wow.
So the thing that's impressed me the most is when we first started out, when integrated circuits began to emerge, it was about 2,500 devices on a piece of silicon. That was the beginning of the integrated circuit world. And most of those were actually resistors. So now we're almost 45 years into the future for me. And, we're talking 100 billion devices on a piece of silicon today. And that is an extraordinary accomplishment. It was the artifact of what became known as Moore's Law. And, there's been, over the last few years, it's certainly changed a good bit. People argue that Moore's Law is ended. Well, it may not have ended, but it's certainly going to slow down a bit because we're reaching a pretty interesting impasse. So a hydrogen atom is 0.1 nanometers in diameter. And so we're talking about doing things which are 3 nanometers. So we're less than an order of magnitude off of where I'm pretty sure we're not getting any smaller than that. So it's not dead, but it's going to change a lot. And so the evolution of where we're going to see, especially in the semiconductor industry, is what we put around and how we do the systems architecture. And I think the creativity that we've had as an industry, that's the thing that probably impresses me the most because we are a creative bunch.
Right. I'm not a vet like you are, but from the time that I've touched technology to now, it's been a huge change. So with that being said, what should companies or organizations start to look for, start to kind of think about as we continuously evolve in this space?
Well, we're at an interesting time in that we're reaching what can only be described as a deluge of data. In fact, if you look at some of the consulting firms out there, people are predicting that by the 2025 kind of time frame, we're going to have 175 to 180 zettabytes of data. And by the way, I think that's a gross underestimate. And the underestimate is that a lot of the things that capture data today aren't included in that. But if you think about worldwide, that's an extraordinary amount of data. So there's an old nursery rhyme that says, it's called The Ancient Mariner. It says, water, water everywhere, nor a drop to drink. And I think for the IT community is we're data everywhere. What is it we're going to keep, or where is it we're going to think? So that's That's the thing. One thing that I would say, if you haven't started putting together a strategy of how you're going to govern your data, what you're going to keep, what you're going to get rid of, you better start now, because the idea of having data all over the place is upon us. So the data governance model, where I'm going to get my information, what I'm going to do with it, and what I'm going to keep for long term, you better get those in place.
Yeah, it's funny. I've been working on that as well, right? Data governance is huge, and I think because when you can understand where your data is and what you want to use, you can actually use it to your advantage if you're a company that produces a product, right? Because now you can take that data and then you can utilize what they call AI or ML, which also leads into another thing that I hate is the word or the term AI. In the compute world, the only thing I understand is ML, which is machine learning. What are your thoughts around the AI ML conversation?
I agree with you. I really dislike the term AI because it's become so let's call it polluted in the way that we look at things. I have a lock on my house. It's got 6 buttons on it, and if you push the right combination, it'll open the door. Is that AI? In some people's mind, it would be, and that causes me a little bit of distress. But you're exactly right. There's the Terminator world where Skynet became aware and started eliminating the carbon organisms. I think we allow things to get munged in together. We are truly in a machine learning world. Now, in the classic definition, AI emerged at the Dartmouth Conference in 1955, and no, I wasn't there. That's not fair. The idea that a computer could do things that seemed like intelligence, that's what started all of this. And where we are today is we're in that machine learning world, and machine learning actually falls into 2 categories. The classic case of machine learning is algorithmic based, where I'm actually looking for patterns. And then what we do mostly today is deep learning, where you take a large set of data that's been tagged and you basically teach a machine to look for those patterns. So the classic, idea around AI is if I see this, then I do this, or if I recognize this and I do this. And if you do enough of those, it appears that you can make some things that are called intelligence. But there is enough error in the models and in the training that you got to be really careful about what you do with these things.
So where do you think companies, I guess, miss in that space, right? I think everybody has this intention of utilizing machine learning to advance their organization or their business. But where do you think they drop the ball, right? Because a lot of companies say they do it, but then when you truly kind of get down deep into the weeds, you really realize that they're not doing anything close to what we believe machine learning is.
Well, I think one of the problems, again, goes back to data. If you look at companies of size, you have not just a single source of data, but you have a lot of sources to data. And usually what happens is there's an owner to that data. So I'm going to go use that data. I have to get, first of all, permission for that data. And then there is this problem of normalizing it. By the way, in the AI world or the data science world, the actual analysis of the data is about 25 or fewer percentage of the problem. It's actually getting the data, making sure that the data makes sense. It's normalized together such that I can do a lot of things, making sure if you're doing machine learning, it is actually tagged and it's correctly tagged. So the preparation of data is, I think, what people underestimate. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to do that, to get to the point where you can actually make rational decisions from it. Then the other thing is drift. If I have data and I have it basically understood and I begin to change the data, how do you recognize that you're off the course of what you wanted to start out with? So I think these are 2 things that you got to be very cognizant of, is how I normalize and prepare the data for use, and then how I detect the idea of drift, meaning that this decision that I'm making based on this learned data is no longer exactly where I wanted it to go to start with. So I think those are the 2 things you got to look out for. And there are tools for helping do those.
Gotcha, understandable. A different question, because obviously the compute world is your space. We've been hearing a lot about quantum computing. Now, what I understand, and just from my own research, is that a lot of these applications aren't even prepared to use that type of power yet that a lot of companies are using. Do you believe that is a fact, or is it just because companies are looking at it from the wrong perspective?
Well, quantum computing is not as conventional computing as we know it. it is taking advantage of some spooky, as Einstein called it, characteristics in quantum physics that that sort of did things a little differently than what we do today. A couple of things about quantum computing. Number one, to get quantum entanglement to occur, which is this process of how particles are interlocked, you kind of got to get to about 15 millikelvins. And that's total absolute temperatures. That's pretty cold. So it's something you're not going to do in your backyard, probably. But the idea of getting a quantum computing, and then it's, there are a couple of interesting characteristics about quantum computing is the quantum entanglements that we talk about, which basically says that I am both in the case of the digital world, I am both a 1 and a 0 at the same time. And once entanglement occurs, you stay entangled until guess what? You look. And once you look to determine where you're at, you break the entanglement. So these are very short. Now that whole process basically requires a new way of dealing with conventional problems that we're only just now beginning to kind of understand. So the idea of programming the way that we see programming occur and what you can do with quantum computing are not exactly close together. Now there are a lot of frameworks that are going to exist that basically take advantage of quantum computing. But this idea that quantum computing is going to replace conventional computing is not going to happen anytime soon. In fact, in the big picture, the amount of conventional computing that you have to basically take advantage of quantum computing, it goes up pretty dramatically. Where we will first see quantum computing begin to emerge is what I would basically consider in the form of an accelerator, where I've got this quantum computing, let's call it accelerator kind of thing. And when I do my work over here, I can go do the quantum computing stuff. Now I can get the parallelism that you want or that quantum computing promises and bring it back into the conventional world and then begin to make sense out of it. But that is a big challenge, and I think the world is just now starting to understand that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, because I think a lot of people misunderstand what it really means. Obviously, in the world of physics, you kind of get it, but everybody doesn't really understand that side.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we're not going to have a quantum email server anytime soon.
Right. Agreed. So what about photo computing?
Photonics. Well, we're kind of at a different time as we progress down the halls of history as well. We're getting to the point where electronics is sort of having to deal with things that basically are actually much easier to deal with in the standpoint of photonics and being able to use photonics. In fact, we're reaching the point where I can no longer put PC board traces on a computer because the characteristics of them are going to be so great that really it becomes something that only light can do, or something at a much higher frequency than what we've been initially dealing with. So we're going to see photonics begin to occur in a lot of places. The kind of the holy grail of photonics is that you have a device that actually has the optical generator on it, and it's transmitted over to another device that has the optical receiver on it. I think we're going to see a lot of that, especially as we get into the middle and the later part of the decade. It's not going to be cheap, and that's the question. How do you return that investment on what the next evolution is going to be? So I think we're going to see a lot of optics begin to emerge, but we're going to have a little bit of sticker shock to start with.
Right. I think it's no different when we first came out with plasma TVs or 4K, right? They first come out, they're like $8,000, $10,000, and you're like, holy smokes. But then to your point, they figured out how to drive costs down into making them, which allowed them to lower the price of them, which now everywhere you go, you can buy a 60-inch TV for $400 probably. We have another great example.
We've been doing incandescent light bulbs ever since Edison, came up with the idea. And so we moved forward with incandescent light bulbs, and then the world seemed to think that compact fluorescent light bulbs were the next step. That was where you basically had a fluorescent tube. And so we're all investing in this idea of being able to do that. And there's some interesting stuff. They got some pretty interesting things about them. They got mercury in them and a few things like that. Suddenly there was a big step forward in light emitting diodes, right? So now basically overnight, it seems that the world shifted to this idea where all of my lights in my house are now light emitting diodes, and they're like 1/20th of the power consumption with an extraordinary amount of light that they generate. We will see the same thing happen as we go forward with photonics and where it hits the industry.
Amazing, amazing. I'm kind of geeking out over here now. So since you're a senior fellow at Dell, I sat on a roundtable with Michael Dell not too long ago, and one of my questions was, how does Dell remain competitive with all of these newer companies coming out with the more modernized frameworks, allowing them to innovate faster, to deliver features faster? How does Dell stay competitive to those particular companies?
Well, I can tell you that one thing that I'm pleased to report and proud of Dell is I've been with Dell since 2002. And whenever there was a shift that was necessary for the company to do it, we did it. We went private. Okay. Michael acquired EMC and joined Dell and EMC together. We just now spun off VMware. So when it comes to how this company can change, I've never seen a company that is able to kind of turn on a dime and change the way it do things. Now, we do have some basic things that we do believe that we're going to continue to do. But the key for us is understanding the right partners, who are the people that we're going to partner with, and basically understanding you and the customer base and what you would like to see from us. And we're really pretty good about doing lots of things all over the world and basically providing it in a way that you want to receive it. So this engagement with the customers and how you want to receive things that technology provides and that Dell can do, I think that's how we continue to stay competitive. And I'm pretty sure we will.
I'm pretty sure you will as well. I have one more thing. What advice would you give a leader who is looking to advance their organization in a technology, from a technology perspective?
Well, that's a tough one. Every organization, so we're like organizations are like organisms. If you take biology as an example, here's a very interesting thing: is the most finely tuned organism is really thriving in an environment. When the environment shifts, you might be in trouble. If you're a biological organism and there's a big shift in your environment, you could be in trouble. So the thing that I would say is there are two things to look for. One is, what is it that your company or your organism or your organization is capable of consuming? You got to know what your people are and where they can go. And then you got to be looking for those things that are the adjacencies that could come take you out. The combination of those are probably the two most important things. And there is this angle that you got to keep going, is the capabilities of your workforce. You have to shift your workforce. You have to provide a new and acquire skills that actually are aligned with that direction you're going to go, and retrain your workforce that exists. You have to be able to make your workforce as mobile as your business needs to be. So those are the three things that I would advise.
Awesome. So do you believe that in the next 5 to 10 years will be software defined everything?
No, I don't. I think we're already software defined everything for all practical purposes. Now, that doesn't mean that the stuff is not what we call in the case of software defined is going to go away. I think that there are ways of doing things that are going to be pervasive and continue to exist for a long time. But I think the level of what software defined is going to bring to the table is certainly going to change. We're looking for ways to create a frontier where the stuff above the frontier is the stuff that business can focus on, that is relying on their business problems. And the stuff that is below the frontier is someone that can provide the right pieces, the right parts, put it together and create stability so that you can offload complexity on both sides. And I think that's where the software-defined world becomes.
Awesome. So I don't want this conversation to stop, but I feel like I got one more question, and this because as a leader now, not just in infrastructure, but in cybersecurity, when we develop products now, is security the first thing on your mind from a person who understands computing? Now, do you have to bring security into the front of that conversation?
In the front, yes, it is the first thing on your mind. And actually, there are two levels of it. There is security, but here is the thing I think that is probably more important than security. And let's describe it as trust. So how do I know what I put together is it's what I thought it was? That's one of the things. If you look at what we've done a lot of work with at Dell, is all the way back to our supply chain, understanding how things are put together and being able to show that stuff that's in that box is actually what I thought it was in that box. And on the other side of this is when I create an interface, that's an exposure that we have to understand. How do I trust the people who are on both sides of the interface, whether they be machines, whether they be people, whether it be other machines, etc.? How do you make sure that there's trust that goes across that interface so that on this side of the interface, I know I'm trusted. On that side of the interface, I know I'm trusted. And then how you interlink those so that you guarantee that trust goes across anything where we created this model where man-machine or machine-machine talk to each other. That is the number one thing that we think about when we look at what we do going forward.
Man, I've never heard anybody break it down that way. That's actually, I'm going to write that down. that's a great way to look at security. I'm sad we're out of time, but I hope one day you and I can meet up in person and share a few beers because I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
I have too, and I'd love to do that.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you joining us, and keep it up, man. Keep us moving in the right direction.
Thank you.
And now I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Ozan Varol. Ozan is a rocket scientist turned award-winning professor and author. His book has numerous accolades, including Amazon's top 20 business books. Welcome, Ozan.
Thank you so much for that introduction, JT. In September 1962, President John F. Kennedy stepped up to a podium at Rice University Stadium and pledged to land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. Now, at the time, this pledge was quite literally a moonshot because so much of what would be required to land on the moon just hadn't been done yet. No American astronaut had worked outside of a spacecraft. 2 spacecraft had never docked together in space. NASA didn't know if the lunar surface was solid enough to support a lander. They didn't know if the communication system would work on the moon. Kennedy actually said some of the metals required to build the rockets haven't even been invented. We jumped into the cosmic void and hoped that we'd grow wings on the way up. And just less than 7 years after Kennedy's pledge, Neil Armstrong took his giant leap for mankind. And just to set that accomplishment in context, a child who was just 6 years old when the Wright brothers took their first flight, which lasted about 10 seconds and moved about 100 feet, that 6-year-old child would be 72 when Neil Armstrong took his giant leap for mankind. That giant leap taken it's just 66 years from Wright brothers to Neil Armstrong, a single human lifespan. It's often celebrated as the triumph of technology. But it really wasn't. It was a triumph of a certain thought process that rocket scientists used to turn the seemingly impossible into the possible. And I write about that thought process in my book, Think Like a Rocket Scientist, where I cover these 4 stages: reimagine, experiment, accelerate, and achieve. And in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to focus on the reimagine stage here. And specifically, I'm going to talk about cognitive diversity. It's much easier to question your assumptions, to launch your moonshot, to reimagine the status quo if you have a team that embraces cognitive diversity and inclusion. And I'm dividing the talk into just 2 components. In the first component, I'm going to talk through what cognitive diversity means and how it's responsible for humankind's most important breakthroughs. And in the second part of the talk, I'm going to talk about why most companies, most businesses undermine cognitive diversity and how to create a corporate culture where cognitive diversity thrives. Okay, so beginning with the first part, what is cognitive diversity? So cognitive diversity is diversity based on different viewpoints, different backgrounds, different life experiences. cognitive diversity can't easily be measured. It's more of a soft metric, which means it gets ignored. And what's more, building cognitive diversity often runs counter to the way that most of us operate. Most of us gravitate toward people who think like us, right? Great minds think alike. We hire people who follow the same path that we did. We hire people who have resumes that look very similar to ours. And as a result, that mindset, that way of thinking, that gravitation toward the like-minded creates an atmosphere of conformity and groupthink, which can stifle creativity and innovation. Cognitive diversity is really important because creating is combining things, of connecting dots, of, comparing apples and oranges, of taking ideas from different disciplines, different fields, and mixing them together to be able to create innovative services and products. It's much easier to think outside the box when your team is playing with multiple boxes. And that approach has created many breakthrough technologies. So Google is one example. The founders of Google took an idea from academia. In academia, the quantity and quality of citations to your paper determines its popularity, its ranking. They took that idea from academia and applied it to the search engine to create Google. So Google ranks search results in terms of both the quantity and the quality of links to that particular result. Netflix is another great example of this. Reed Hastings, who was a co-founder of Netflix, he was a software programmer before he started Netflix. He had rented Apollo 13, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. And he misplaced the DVD and he had incurred like $30 or $40 in late fees. He finally found the DVD. He took it back to the Blockbuster where he had rented it from and then headed over to the gym. And he's upset that he had to pay $40 in late fees. So he's working out. And in the middle of his workout, it occurs to him that in his gym, you pay one monthly fee. You pay $40 a month and you could use the gym as little or as much as you want. And he thought to himself, what if I took that idea, which is so well established in the fitness industry, and applied it to video rentals? And that was a seed that created the idea for Netflix, where you pay one monthly fee and you can rent as many movies or as little movies as you want. As these examples show, an innovation, a breakthrough in one industry can begin with the adoption of an idea from a completely different industry. Now, in most cases, the fit isn't going to be perfect, but the mere practice of combining things, of looking to different industries for ideas, different viewpoints for ideas, will spark new lines of thinking. Now, we often fetishize the lone genius, toiling away somewhere by themselves and creating breakthrough products and technologies. Right? This is the story of Steve Jobs building the first Apple computer from the garage of his family home. It makes for a compelling story, but like most stories, it's a misleading depiction of how things actually work. Optimal creativity doesn't happen in complete isolation. Breakthroughs almost always have a collaborative, a group component to them. People come to the table with diverse perspectives. They bring their own life experiences and viewpoints to the group for people to connect and combine ideas. Businesses who embrace cognitive diversity tend to get ahead. One example here is Google X. So Google, this is Google's notoriously secretive moonshot factory. X doesn't innovate for Google. X's job is to create the next Google. And at X, these breakthrough technologies are created by a team that embraces cognitive diversity. This is Obi Felton. She works at X. Her title is the head of getting moonshots ready for contact with the real world. That's her actual title. And she says the best ideas come from great teams, not from great men. And X takes cognitive diversity to a whole new level. The company will hire firefighters and pianists and diplomats and journalists and politicians. You might find an aerospace engineer working together with a fashion designer, or a special operations veteran throwing ideas around with a laser expert. And these teams, because of the diversity that they bring, have developed breakthrough technologies ranging from self-driving cars to autonomous drones, from hot air balloons that deliver internet service to contact lenses that measure glucose levels in your eye. Now, when you do have a team that robust in terms of diversity of viewpoints, it can be hard to maintain unity. It can be hard to create group cohesion. And I'm going to give you an example from my own life of how, I think a very good example of how you can embrace cognitive diversity while also maintaining team unity. So I worked on the operations team for the 2003 Mars Exploration Rovers project, which sent 2 rovers to Mars in 2003. Now, every Mars mission brings together 2 very different groups of people. You've got scientists and engineers. These tend to get lumped together in popular culture, but they're actually very, very different thinkers. So scientists tend to be more idealistic. They are the idealistic explorers of the cosmos. They have grand ideas and grand visions of what they want to achieve in a mission like this one. Engineers tend to be a lot more pragmatic. So they have to take these wild ideas from scientists and actually have to make them fit on board a rover. And they have to deal with budgets and resources and constraints. And when you bring these 2 very different groups of thinkers together, it can go in one of 2 ways. One, on the bad missions, that relationship can turn really sour. It can be like a bad relationship, a bad marriage. But on the really good missions, and my mission was one of them for reasons I'll get to in just a minute, on the really good missions, it turns into this symphony where each group is bringing their own perspective to the table, but while also respecting the perspectives of the other members of the group. So on my mission, my boss, who was the principal investigator, did a phenomenal job of making sure that these 2 very different groups of thinkers worked in harmony with one another. So if you walked into one of our mission planning meetings and you had a room full of scientists and engineers, you'd be hard pressed to tell which people were scientists and which people were engineers. If you listen to the conversation, each group was so well versed in each other's language, in each other's thinking, that you just couldn't tell them apart. And that's really a testament to my boss. And he ensured that we could do that because he asked us to learn the other group's perspective. So as a scientist, I had to learn engineering, at least some engineering. I had to be able to look at the mission from an engineer's perspective. And the engineers had to learn some science. They had to step outside of their shoes and look at the mission from the perspective of a scientist. So I think that ability to shift perspectives and see what other members of the group is seeing is a really powerful way of making sure that you're not just stuck in your own limited perspective and can actually look at the challenges from the perspective of others in the group. And you can do this in a number of different ways. I think every CEO should answer the customer service line from time to time, just to be able to adopt that particular perspective. Every actor should direct a movie. Every person, every now and then, should step outside of their own viewpoint and look at the issues from the perspective of others. And I think this cohesion is one of the reasons why our mission was so successful. We designed the rovers to last for 90 days. And one of the 2 rovers ended up roving the Red Planet for 14 years into its 90-day mission. Another way to develop cognitive diversity is to bring together not just people from different fields, different viewpoints, but also people with varying degrees of expertise. So combining experts and amateurs, outsiders and insiders. There's a story I love about a kindergarten teacher who was walking around the room to check each child's work as they drew pictures. The teacher went up to one of the girls in the classroom and he said, "What are you drawing?" And the girl said, "I'm drawing God." The teacher was shocked at this answer because he's expecting rainbows or butterflies, so he's dumbfounded. So he says, "Well, no one knows what God looks like." And she says, "They will in a minute." And I love that story because you've got this difference between the teacher who's stuck with the status quo to the established way of doing things, of what a picture is supposed to look like, and then a complete outsider, an amateur who's willing to bring a completely different perspective, a completely different drawing to the table. Experts are often too close to the problem to think differently. They're too ingrained in what's worked in the past. The status quo becomes easier to reimagine when you're not completely wedded to the status quo. Now, don't get me wrong, expertise is really valuable. What I'm suggesting is more limited. If the goal is to generate transformative ideas, experts shouldn't work in isolation. They also benefit from input from outsiders. Now, this doesn't mean bringing in an expensive consultant. It could be as simple as asking your significant other to give input on what you're working on, or bringing in a team member from a different division or a different project on your company who knows nothing about your particular work, and inviting them to ask questions. Amateurs have a way of asking what people call dumb questions that are actually not dumb at all. They tend to be very simple questions, but they go to some fundamental aspect of the problem that you're probably neglecting because you're way too close to the problem. So they ask great questions that jolt you outside of your perspective. One of the great stories here is about J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling is the author of the Harry Potter books, and when she wrote the first Harry Potter book and submitted it to publishers for publication, the publishers were unanimous in their opinion. They all thought that the book was not worth printing, except for one publisher in the UK. The book ended up on the desk of a guy named Nigel Newton, who was the head of Bloomsbury Publishing. And he took the book home and he gave the first chapter to his bookworm daughter, 8-year-old bookworm daughter, Alice. And Alice took up the first chapter to her room. She finished it. She came back downstairs and she said, "Dad, this is better than anything else I've read." And that input from an 8-year-old convinced her father to write a 2,500 pound check to J.K. Rowling to acquire the rights to publish Harry Potter. That was the best bet made in publishing history because J.K. Rowling is now a billion-dollar author. And it's all because, unlike the other publishing houses, Nigel Newton was willing to step outside of his echo chamber and get the perspective of an outsider to the publishing industry, his daughter, but an insider, a member of the audience that the book was supposed to serve. Okay, that brings me to the second part of the talk. I have about 6 minutes left. I just went over cognitive diversity and why it's so important. That opportunity to interact with people from different walks of life, unfortunately, doesn't exist in most organizations. And even when there is diversity, most businesses don't do a great job of actually including those diverse voices in the conversation. So even if you do have diversity in the room, it doesn't necessarily mean that people's opinions are going to be listened to. I'm going to share with you a cautionary story of what happens when inclusion is ignored. And then I'll give you a few ideas on what you can do to make sure that cognitive diversity thrives in your organization. Now, think back to January 28, 1986. If you are American and you're older than 6 years old, chances are that you remember exactly where you were on that date in question. On that date, the Space Shuttle Challenger tragically exploded over the Atlantic Ocean, killing all 7 members of its crew. The faults ended up being in these O-rings that Nobel laureate Richard Feynman is holding in this photo you're looking at. He served on the Accident Investigation Commission. These rings perform a critical function on the space shuttle, and for them to perform that function, they have to be flexible. And when the weather turns cold, when it gets cold, they turn brittle and they might fail, which is exactly what happened with the Challenger. On the morning of Challenger's launch, the temperatures at Cape Canaveral were uncharacteristically cold. 2 engineers raised their hands and said, "Hey, we need to delay the launch." But the managers overruled them. The O-rings failed, and with them, the entire shuttle. The problem with the O-rings wasn't new. NASA had been flying space shuttles with damaged O-rings for about 5 years before Challenger even happened. 6 months before the Challenger accident, an engineer wrote a memo that turned out to be quite prescient. He said, if we don't do something about the O-ring problem, the result could be a catastrophe of the highest order. I'm talking about the loss of human life. But that memo was ignored. The management wasn't bringing in these viewpoints and wasn't engaging with them. They were too stuck on the past. They said, look, as long as we follow process, as long as we follow what worked in the past, nothing bad can happen. And we've flown missions before with damaged O-rings and nothing bad resulted. And as long as we repeat what we did yesterday, then we can expect the same sort of success, which tragically turned out not to be the case. Now, 17 years later, it happened again with the Space Shuttle Columbia. This time around, the technical flaw was completely different, but the underlying flaw was exactly the same. Once again, engineers raised their hands and said, look, this large piece of foam separated from the shuttle during takeoff. It can be really dangerous. But the management ignored them. So NASA didn't just have an O-ring problem. They didn't just have a foam shedding problem. They also had a conformity problem. They had a groupthink problem. What use is hiring these brilliant rocket scientists if they don't feel psychologically safe to speak up, to share what they think? So how do you make sure that this doesn't happen in your organizations? How do you promote psychological safety? There was a study done by Amy Edmondson at Harvard Business School about medication errors. That's when a wrong drug is given to the patient in the hospital, and those errors are shockingly common. And she wanted to investigate why they were happening. And she asked herself a simple question. Do better hospital teams make fewer medication mistakes? Now, the answer seems obvious. Better teams with better performing members and leaders should make fewer mistakes. But the data show the exact opposite. Better teams were making more mistakes, not less. She was confused about this, so she went out onto the field herself to investigate. And it turned out that better teams weren't making more mistakes. They were simply reporting more mistakes. Better teams had an environment where nurses were willing to raise their hands and said, hey, there is a failure here. There was a mistake made here, and willing to share what they were thinking with their managers. So that's called psychological safety. And the best performing teams in the study had an environment of psychological safety. The worst performing teams did not. In the worst performing teams, when someone made a mistake, they would get chastised for it. They would get blamed for it. It would be like ending up in the principal's office. And because of that, when mistakes were made on those teams, no one would speak up. They would hide their errors. And that, of course, led to a vicious cycle, right? These worst performing teams who were in most need of improvement weren't improving because no one was sharing the mistakes and failures that were happening. This is Sarah Blakely. She's the founder of Spanx, the apparel company. She went from selling fax machines door to door to becoming the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. And she credits her success to a question that her father would ask her on a regular basis when she was growing up. Her father would ask, what did you fail at recently and what did you learn from it? If Sarah didn't have an answer, her father would be disappointed. This is psychological safety at work. In asking his children what they failed at on a regular basis, Sarah's father gave them the breathing room to try interesting problems and to fail from time to time. To him, failing to try was far more disappointing than failure itself. I'll wrap up the talk on this slide here. There is another component to psychological safety, which is if employees are to share their mistakes, the leaders have to do the same. So the leaders have to follow by example. Sarah Blakely, the woman I just talked about, she highlights her own mistakes during company-wide meetings. So she'll say, here are the mistakes I made over the past quarter. Ad Catmull, who used to be the president at Pixar, at new employee orientations, he would share the mistakes that he made in building and bringing Pixar to where it is today. So if leaders fail to acknowledge their failures, if there is a perception that the leader can do no wrong, then it's unreasonable to expect employees to expect team members to actually raise their hand and reveal their own mistakes. All right, I'm gonna pause there and invite JT to come join me for the Q&A section of the presentation.
Thank you, Ozan. I really appreciate it. That was a great insight on cognitive diversity. I think a lot of people tend to take it for granted. I see a lot of value in it. I'm a big believer in it. It has helped me thus far as a leader, and I continue to follow it because I understand the importance of it. But we received a ton of questions, so let's just jump right in so we can make sure we can cover everything. And for anybody else who has any additional questions, please put them in the chat and/or put them in Q&A. All right, so first question. Why do companies struggle with developing cognitive diversity?
I think it happens for a number of reasons, but really the most important one is that we tend to gravitate toward people who think the way that we do, right? We like people who agree with us. We like to be proven right. And because of that natural way of operating, right, we feel good when others validate what we think. And so because of that natural way of thinking, we tend to hire people who follow the similar path that we did. And we tend to retain people who tend to agree with us. And I think many leaders, unfortunately, tend to view negatively the people who raise their hands and who disagree with the leader, who show a different path forward. I think it's the rare leader who sees the value in diverse perspectives and diverse viewpoints, and who actually appreciates team members and encourages them to point out where the leader may have gone wrong. So I think, and this often happens subconsciously. So, we're not actively thinking as a leader, we're not actively thinking like, oh, I'm going to create an environment where cognitive diversity doesn't exist. It's just, it's happening at a very below the level area where you're not really noticing that it's lacking in your organization until it's too late.
Gotcha. That's great. That's the pros and the cons of it. So great insight. So a different question. This one, I think I'll be interested to hear your perspective on. So have you ever experienced working for an organization that never invested in cognitive diversity?
For sure. So I was in academia for about 10 years. I was a professor for 10 years. And academia, this is true for many schools, is, at least at the faculty level, is lacking in cognitive diversity. The faculty hiring process tends to focus on faculty members who graduated from the same elite colleges and universities, did the same type of fellowship, and followed the same type of path, wrote the same types of articles that the existing faculty members wrote. And so when you step into a typical college and university, and if you walk into a faculty meeting room, the voices that come up tend to echo each other, because the hiring process focuses so much on hiring people who followed a similar path. And that, I think, also leads to tunnel vision, right? Because I've sat in countless faculty meetings, more than I care to remember. And unfortunately, most of them, the dissenting voices just didn't exist. Somebody would share an idea, and the idea would resonate with just 99% of the people in the room because they all thought alike. And the 1% who didn't think alike, who maybe saw a different way of thinking, because they were so overwhelmed by this homogenous group around them, didn't feel safe to raise their hands and share a different opinion. And in many cases, because they might not have tenure, for example, right? They're younger. And so their promotion depends on other faculty members in the room voting yes to them. And so as a young faculty member, I didn't feel safe. Even when I disagreed with a viewpoint presented in the room, I didn't feel safe to raise my hand and say, you know what, I disagree. There's actually a different, and I think a better path forward. And I think a lot of colleges and universities, because of that reason, get stuck with the status quo, get stuck looking at the rearview mirror and doing what they did in the past.
Okay, so let's kind of continue down this path. So how do you help develop that critical thinking, if our universities are kind of stuck in that groupthink mindset?
Well, I think one is focusing on And this has to be conscious effort, right? Conscious effort on hiring people from different viewpoints and different backgrounds who didn't maybe go to the same elite college that the existing faculty members did, or who have a different ideological orientation than the existing faculty members do. And I think that this is true for businesses as well, right? And so the effort needs to be conscious because we're not aware that we're doing this, right? We're not aware that we are hiring people who think like us. The effort to overcome that natural conditioning has to be an affirmative one. So when you do approach the hiring process, you have to come in saying, we're going to look for diverse candidates. We're going to look for viewpoints at resumes that are not being represented on our faculty. But that itself is not enough. So once you do bring in those diverse voices into the room, you now have to make a point to actually include them in the conversation, to make sure that they feel psychologically safe to actually speak up. So a disaster like Challenger doesn't happen, because having those people in the room doesn't guarantee that their viewpoints are going to be represented. And that's where psychological safety comes into play. So once you do bring them into the room, then it becomes really important for the leader to say, okay, you're in the room, you get to share your opinion. And once you share your opinion, it doesn't mean that the opinion is going to be accepted, but it means at least that we're going to engage with you. We're going to listen to you. We're going to respect what you're saying, take what you're saying into account. Again, doesn't mean that we're going to follow it, but at least give it the time of day that it deserves. And I didn't get into this in the talk, but in both Challenger and Columbia, when engineers raised their hands and shared concerns about what was going on, the management didn't even engage with them. They didn't even bother to investigate what was going on. Their views were completely shut out. So again, bringing in people isn't enough. That's just the first step. And then you have to make sure that you actually do have an environment of psychological safety where those viewpoints can be shared.
Awesome, awesome. So now with that being said, now we understand what cognitive diversity is. We understand some of the ways that you can be successful at it. How do you measure it though? How do you measure success in a business or a university or some organization, whether cognitive diversity was successful or not?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it can be hard to measure because again, the cognitive diversity itself is not an easily quantifiable metric, and so whether or not it's actually working can be difficult to measure. But there are some things you can do. If you walk into a meeting in this company and you sit in on the meeting for a half hour, say a brainstorming session, are people feeling free to share ideas that diverge from the norm? Or is one voice, one viewpoint dominating the conversation? If you look at the products and the services that the company is generating, are these products and services just the same year after year? Or is the company innovating? Are they identifying new opportunities that they couldn't see before? Are they developing new products and services that break the norm, that reimagine the status quo in some fashion? Because again, cognitive diversity is directly linked to innovation. And so to the extent that innovation is there, innovation can't exist without cognitive diversity. So if you do look at the output, and if you are seeing a creative and innovative environment, then that probably means you've got cognitive diversity working well as well.
How do you explain to leaders that it's important to do retrospectives? And when we say retrospective, it's how do we review the things we did well? How do we review the things that we didn't do well? And then how do we improve it going forward?
Yeah, great question. So number one, I think regardless of what happened, regardless of whether the project was a failure or success, I think it's really important to follow the exact same review process. So with a success, you ask yourself what went right, and certainly pat yourself on the back for what went right, but also ask what went wrong. Because it's possible to do some things wrong and still succeed. And so it's important to identify what went wrong in a success, to pick up on those small failures, like the O-rings in the Challenger accident, right? So NASA had all of these successful missions in the lead up to the Challenger accident, even though things were going wrong with those missions. And if you don't do that type of retrospective of looking back at the success and asking what went right with this and what went wrong with it and what can we learn from it, then you're not going to be able to identify those small failures before they snowball into something that you can't control. And it's the exact same idea with the failure. So asking what went wrong with this failure and certainly fixing what went wrong, but also asking what went right with this failure. Because it's possible to do some things right and still fail. The conditions may not have been right for that particular project to work, or one aspect of the project may have worked well and another aspect may not have. Like you can design the perfect Martian spacecraft, but a dust storm can make it fail, right? And that's something outside of your control. And so really focusing on the inputs that went into the project during that retrospective and isolating what went wrong and learning from what went wrong, and then retaining what went right. And on a more day-to-day basis, I think this also requires giving space to people to actually think and reflect. And I know this is in many businesses, this is a novel thing because we're moving from one email to the next, one notification to the next, one meeting to the next, without the ability to just pause and reflect and think. It's impossible to innovate while you're hustling all the time. I think what happens, and this is proven by research, is when you do have the ability to think. So when you step away from your desk, sit on a chair, go for a walk, your subconscious kicks into high gear and it begins connecting dots. It begins making these associations between different ideas in your brain. So the example I mentioned of Reed Hastings is a great one, right? So the idea for Netflix occurred to him, not when he was answering emails, but when he was at the gym working out, when he was letting himself daydream for his mind to drift. And if you're like most people, your best ideas come to you in the shower because you're in this, distraction-free environment. You don't have any notifications coming at you, and you have the ability to actually reflect, to daydream, to drift. And I think because our work days tend to get so packed, we have to be intentional about building in those downtimes into the way that we operate. And again, this can be as simple as going for a 10-minute walk around the building. Don't listen to a podcast, don't listen to anything, but actually sit with your thoughts and let your mind drift. It can be playing an instrument. Einstein, famously, when he was stuck in the middle of a problem, he'd leave the problem, he'd pick up the violin, he'd start playing it, and in the middle of a song, he'd go, I got it. And the idea would just seemingly magically come to him. So many scientists came up with their greatest ideas when they were just on a stroll through a park somewhere. And again, this was before the day of smartphones and podcasts. And so it's really important to carve off that time to actually sit alone with your thoughts from time to time.
Absolutely. Being a person who tends to run at 100 miles per hour a lot of the time, I learned that it is important to disconnect. Mm-hmm. And every time that I disconnect, I come back with another level of enthusiasm on trying to work through what is the next thing we want to accomplish as an organization. Ozan, thank you again for your insights. This presentation was amazing. And I hope everybody that was a part of this event today got a lot from that cognitive diversity conversation. I think there's a lot of things that Ozan said that you can take and apply within your organization so you can reach another level of success. I think a lot of people tend to want to do things the same way, but when you start looking at it and thinking differently, new ideas come up. And I'm a big proponent of that. I think that is how I've been operating for a while as a leader, and that's how I will continue to operate. I think it gives my team that ability, that safe space to feel comfortable to think outside of the box, right? And also, please share your feedback. We really enjoy this event. We take this event very seriously, along with our other events, but this one I think is the staple to the CONVERGED User Group. So we love any feedback that you have because we want to continuously get better. We're looking to improve. We're looking to be innovative. We're looking to utilize cognitive diversity in areas that we think can evolve the CONVERGED User Group to that next level. And please be on the lookout for the remainder of the year. We have a few more events for the CONVERGED User Group. And also, from the entire board, we want to thank you for attending our event today. And we want to also thank you for being a member of the CONVERGED User Group.